Greetings, everyone. My name is Mark McInroy, and I am delighted to welcome you to the first installment of our four-part series titled The Beauty of God, a short course in theological aesthetics. Theological aesthetics, for those who do not know, is a field of academic study that views beauty as a divine attribute, as a property of God. And in this series, we will first examine the beauty of God in the early church among so-called patristic figures, the church fathers. Then in our second session next week, we will look at icons and iconoclasm. Our third session will examine the decline of beauty in the modern period, after which our fourth session will look at the return of beauty to theological discourse in the 20th and 21st centuries. If that's our big picture plan for the next 4 weeks, let's speak for a moment about today's session. We will first establish today that ancient Christian theologians often described God as beautiful. And crucially, such an idea did not come from fringe figures, but instead major patristic theologians, such as Augustine of Hippo, Origen of Alexandria, and Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. Some of those might be familiar, others less so. They're all extremely influential patristic theologians. As we discuss what ancient figures meant by the beauty of God, we will also examine the related topic of the beauty that we find in the world. And we will see that an intimate, complex relationship pertains between the two. Third, we will talk for a moment about what exactly beauty does for Christianity and the life of faith. In other words, some of the implications of God being beautiful, in particular as it pertains to desire. And last, we will discuss an unexpected, intriguing aspect of these figures' understandings, which is that the beauty of God radiates from God invisibly, paradoxical though such a claim might be. So, beauty of God, beauty of the world, what it means for God to be beautiful, and the radiant invisibility. Here we go. As we begin then, we should first note that figures such as Augustine, Origen, Dionysius, and others, in speaking of God as beautiful, did not mean what we often think of when we think of the word beauty. As modern persons, we frequently associate beauty with matters that pertain to surface level appearance. During week 3, we will look closely at the reasons that modern figures so characterize beauty. But the beautiful to many today is certainly enjoyable, but it's often regarded as ultimately trivial. It's nice to have beauty around if you can manage to do so. But when it comes down to it, for many people today, beauty pertains to embellishment, ornamentation. It is ultimately as inconsequential as a bauble that adorns a vanity. For patristic figures, by contrast, beauty describes things at their most fundamental level. Beauty could not be more important. Indeed, it is an indispensable way of talking about God and the world. To talk about why that is, we begin with Augustine of Hippo. Many of you know Augustine is a towering figure in the history of theology. What might be less well known is that descriptions of the beauty of God permeate his writings. In his Confessions, Augustine famously says of God, "Late have I loved thee, O beauty, so ancient and so new." And in one of his soliloquies, he continues on the theme as follows: "O God, the good and the beautiful, in whom and by whom and through whom all things are good and beautiful." God to Augustine is absolute beauty, unsurpassable beauty, beauty with a capital B. And God has created a world that reflects the divine beauty in all things. We see a similar idea in the 6th century theologian known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who is a major figure, especially in the Christian East. In his divine names, he goes through the various names that can be applied to God, and he reflects on the meaning of God being called beauty. As he puts it, the super-essential beautiful is called beauty because of that quality which it imparts to all things. and because it is the cause of the harmony and splendor in all things, flashing forth upon them all like light, the beautifying communications of its originating ray. These descriptions and others from the ancient church make clear not only that God is beautiful, but also that whatever beauty is in the world comes from God, the beautiful source of all beauty. And this idea that worldly beauty has its source in divine beauty gestures toward just how very important beauty is for these figures. Beauty for them is far from ornamental embellishment. Beauty describes one of the central features of God and creation. Beauty is, to use a term that is developed a few centuries later, a transcendental property of being. Transcendental property of being. That is, beauty does not apply to some things but not others, according to Christian theology. Instead, beauty transcends particular things in the world, hence that term, transcendental. And it applies to all things that exist. Simply put, to exist, to be, to have being, is to be beautiful. Beauty is a property that inheres within everything that is. Things can certainly display varying degrees of beauty, but the very fact of existence itself involves being beautiful. To be at all is to be beautiful. Now, if this is a rather bold view of beauty in the world at the foundation of all things, we hasten to add that any beauty found in the world will not match the beauty of God. There is certainly a relationship between divine beauty and worldly beauty, but the beauty of God is absolute. It cannot be surpassed. Patristic theologians, in other words, preserve the notion that God surpasses, exceeds the world. And the beauty of God is one of many places where we see that God cannot be reduced to what we find in creatures. This gets expressed as an analogical relationship. That is, the beauty of God is analogous to the beauty of the world, even if God's beauty will far surpass any beauty we find in creation. Interestingly, what this means is that beauty in the world can show us something of what God is like. Certainly, we must keep in mind that God transcends what we find in the world, but it is not the case that worldly beauty simply has nothing to do with God. Indeed, the beauty we find in the world bears the imprint of its beautiful creator. God's signature, so to speak, is in the created order. Any beauty we encounter here gives us some hint, even if it is ultimately a pale imitation of what God is like. So we have seen so far that God is beautiful, according to ancient Christian theologians, and we have also seen that the beauty of the world comes from that beautiful God. This idea brings us directly to our third topic of the day, namely what beauty does for Christianity and for the life of faith. If it is the case that God is beautiful and that the world reflects that glorious beauty of the divine, then relationship with God has an aesthetic dimension to it. In other words, being in relationship with God bears some affinities with our encounters with the most moving art we have ever experienced. The life of faith is akin in important ways to our response to beauty in the natural world. Now, as soon as we say this, we must qualify the claim by making clear that any beauty we encounter in the world will be far surpassed by the experience of divine beauty. Nevertheless, thinking of God as beautiful stands to reconfigure our relationship with God, to recast it as an aesthetically charged encounter. The ancient Christian theologian Origen of Alexandria understood well this implication of calling God beautiful, and he used the Song of Songs in the Bible in order to talk about relationship with God as shot through with desire. Now, as a number of you know, the Song of Songs describes the desire of a bride and bridegroom for one another. and it uses powerful, evocative language throughout. For instance, the song reads, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Your name is perfume poured out. Therefore the maidens love you. Draw me after you, let us make haste. The king has brought me into his chambers. We will exult and rejoice in you. We will extol your love more than wine." Some are rather surprised to find verses such as these in the Bible. And in the early church, this text was reserved for those who were more advanced in the life of faith. It was not given to beginners, lest they misunderstand and misapply it. Origen and others used this text as an allegory for the relationship between the human being and God. To Origen, this text ultimately calls for a transformation of desire, such that it is directed at God. Origen holds that we yearn for God with the same urgency with which the bride and bridegroom long for one another. Such a description of God as beautiful, as something for which we desire, does indeed stand to recast the life of faith in important ways. What it means is that we pursue relationship with God, not out of obligation, not because it's something that we have to do, but instead because it feeds us in ways that are even more fulfilling than our most profound experiences with beauty in the world. God fulfills our longings as nothing else can. As Augustine famously puts it at the beginning of his Confessions, "Our hearts are restless, O Lord, until they rest in thee." Now, having treated our first, second, and third points, in the time that remains, I would like to explore a somewhat surprising feature of patristic understandings of the beauty of God. We see it vividly in Augustine and Origen, the former of whom says the following in his Confessions: "What do I love, O God, when I love thee? Not the beauty of a body, nor the rhythm of moving time, not the splendor of the light, which is so dear to the eyes, not the sweet melodies in the world of sounds of all kinds, not the fragrance of flowers, balms, and spices, not manna and not honey, not the bodily members which are so treasured by carnal embrace. None of this do I love when I love my God. And yet I do love a light and a sound and a fragrance and a delicacy and an embrace when I love my God, who is light and sound and fragrance and delicacy and embrace to my interior man. There my soul receives a radiance that no space can grasp. There something resounds which no time can take away. There something gives a fragrance which no wind can dissipate. There something is savored which no satiety can make bitter. There something is embraced which can occasion no ennui. This is what I love when I love my God." As aesthetically charged as this description is, we notice that Augustine consistently maintains that God's beauty is not physical beauty. On the one hand, Augustine summons all five senses, sight, hearing, smell, touch, and taste, in his description of God. On the other hand, in every case, Augustine tells his reader that God does not manifest in such a way that God makes God's self available to those bodily senses. And yet, that's not quite the end of the story, because after disabusing his reader of the notion that God reveals God's self physically, Augustine goes on to say that God is indeed a light and sound and fragrance and delicacy and embrace to his inner person. There are, in other words, sense faculties that perceive, not the physical, but instead the spiritual, you could say. And it is in this way that Augustine claims we encounter God. God's invisibility, God's immateriality, then, do not stop God from being experienced in an aesthetic manner. God's beauty cannot be seen by our bodily eyes, but God does nevertheless radiate invisible beauty that our spiritual sight beholds. Origen even goes so far as to apply this description of God's invisible beauty to Christ, whom many regard as the sensible display of God the Father. To Origen, however, quote, "The Father begat the Son, his own image, so that, as he is himself invisible by nature, he also begat an image that was invisible." Even in God's revelation in Christ, then, the divine nature remains invisible, demonstrating commitment to two seemingly irreconcilable claims. On the one hand, we encounter the beauty of God. On the other hand, that beauty is not physical and cannot be seen with our bodily eyes. I will leave you with that to ponder. But as an enticement for next week's session on icons and iconoclasm, I will let you know that the invisibility of divinity features prominently in the arguments of those who would forbid the use of images in Christian worship. And the idea that God is invisible yet ultimately seen wins the day, as the use of images is defended in the early church. More next week. Thanks for tuning in.